You're all very welcome. Thank you for joining this first in the series of 6 national panel webinars. This webinar is looking at the November report on national review into child sexual abuse within the family environment. So we're going to hear from the national panel today, and we're going to be focusing on the learning outcomes and the recommendations from the report. So please add your comments and questions as we go through, and then after the first presentation we'll have a Q&A session which I will then lead through with your questions, and of course at any time just raise your hand in MS Teams and you're very welcome to ask a good old-fashioned verbal question as well. First of all, I want to hand over to the chair, Annie Hudson, who's going to welcome you to the webinar and talk about what the national panel are going to deliver to you today. So Annie, over to you.
Most importantly, welcome to everybody from me, Annie Hudson. I'm chair of the panel, and you'll hear from different colleagues as we move through the presentation today. Really pleased by the kind of real strong interest, which I know reflects a kind of system-wide concern for us to think and work differently and better sometimes in relation to how we support and protect children who've been abused in their families. And today's an opportunity to reflect on the findings and the recommendations from the review, and to hear your take and your thoughts about those findings and those recommendations. I think it's really important to recognise at the outset that by shining a light on sexual abuse in the families, we are highlighting what we all know to be very complex, complicated and very sensitive issues around which there is still very significant taboos in terms of talking about in sort of public spaces and sometimes in professional spaces too. And we know, through the work that we all do together, that these issues will affect people in different ways, and we need to just sort of recognise that. I think what I also wanted to say by way of introduction was that the panel and the centre who's worked with us really closely on this review have really appreciated and want to acknowledge the kind of candour, the openness and the reflections that people have brought to the many meetings that we've had as part of the research and evidence gathering process. And so I think this has been a journey for the panel and hopefully also for particularly those who contributed to the evidence base in this review. We decided to undertake and initiate this thematic review for a number of reasons. I mean, first and foremost, because we were seeing through rapid reviews and LCSPRs a lot of evidence that across the system, the multi-agency practice and the kind of leadership behind that sometimes did not have the confidence and the necessary skills and knowledge and understanding and capabilities to really protect and help children and families who are affected by sexual abuse in their families, and that sometimes the sort of needs, voices and experiences of children gets kind of lost in the complicated processes, and that too often there is that kind of siloed working around decision making. And we wanted as well to give attention to this because there has been, and we've seen this particularly in the last couple of weeks, a lot of very much needed and very urgent attention on abuse outside of the home, whether that's in institutions, and whether that's because of famous people being at the focus of inquiries, whether it's about group-based sexual offending. And there has been a lot of attention, and there's been more attention just in the last couple of weeks, as everybody well knows. But perhaps we've lost the spotlight that is needed, that we do need to give to the experience of children who are abused in their families. And of course, that is not an uncommon experience for too many children. And there are lots of similarities with other forms of sexual abuse in other contexts, but there are also some differences which we wanted to explore. So we were really delighted to work very closely.
So I'm Anna Glinsky from the Centre for Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse, and I'm going to talk through the next couple of slides with you, starting first of all to give you a sense of the research that we undertook and talking through some of these key figures, and then moving on to talk about the key findings. So in undertaking this research, we analysed 136 rapid reviews and 40 Safeguarding Children's Practice Reviews, and that covered 193 children. We also undertook a review of recent research and practice guidance. We did 10 online reflective group discussions, which included 107 practitioners across 9 partnerships that were involved in the reviews. We undertook 2 face-to-face interviews with young people who were subject to the reviews, and 5 face-to-face interviews with people who had abused children in 5 of the reviews. We also held 6 roundtable discussions with 60 different practitioners and experts by experience to talk about some of the issues within practice. And then throughout the process of doing the recommendations, we engaged strongly with cross-government departments, with roundtables and a range of stakeholders, including Home Office, Department of Education, Department of Health and Social Care, Ministry of Justice, and His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service. So in terms of the findings, you can see the statistics, kind of key statistics, and there are many more than this. 3/4 of the children were under the age of 12, which is fairly significant. Nearly a quarter involved children with learning disabilities, autism or ADHD. And just over a quarter of children were from Black or other minoritised communities. Now, the impacts were wide-ranging, as you can imagine. However, some of the most serious were 10 of the children became pregnant. So in terms of the findings, you can see the statistics, kind of key statistics, and there are many more than this. 3/4 of the children were under the age of 12, which is fairly significant. Nearly a quarter involved children with learning disabilities, autism or ADHD. And just over a quarter of children were from Black or other minoritised communities. Now, the impacts were wide-ranging, as you can imagine. However, some of the most serious were 10 of the children became pregnant, the youngest of whom was 11, and 7 children died by suicide, and many more children than that were attempting suicide in their lives. In terms of the cross-cutting themes that the National Panel had asked us to look particularly at, nearly half of the reviews that we looked at involved neglect. A third of the reviews involved domestic abuse experienced by children, and over a third of reviews featured a family member with a known history of sexual offending or who was known to present some risk of sexual harm. So now onto the findings. I think firstly, the important thing to say is that the findings of this national review highlighted a systemic failure across all services to recognise and respond to child sexual abuse. So these findings need to be considered in the context of those system challenges. I'm going to talk through these 4 themes and give you some detail on each. So first of all, in relation to our first theme is around not hearing children's voices and understanding their needs. And interestingly, while we know from research that most children don't tell about their sexual abuse at the time that it's happening, in this sample, 3/4 of children had attempted to tell, had clearly told someone, and some of them had repeatedly told that, and yet we hadn't responded in the way that we should have done. We also, however, had young people in this sample who didn't feel able to tell, and actually one of them was the one who gave us the title for this report. And she said, "I couldn't talk about the sexual abuse, it was too difficult. I wanted them all to notice and to ask me what was going on." What we also saw, and that links very clearly to what we saw in this theme around practitioners not talking to children and not being able to talk to children about sexual abuse, while also relying on children to tell them in order to take action. So we spoke to practitioners in round tables who said, if only they had told us, we could have done something. And this assumption that you can't ask children. So you can't just ask people questions. You can't just ask children because we might be leading them. And that very strongly exists in practice, that kind of idea around talking to children. Also, that where children did tell, as we can see from the sample, that they weren't believed. And actually what often happened is if children retracted what they said, we took the retraction more seriously than we did their initial kind of report of abuse. We saw practitioners not giving children information that they needed. So, for example, a young person who was placed with a convicted sexual offender, but who wasn't told that that was the case. And she reflected, actually, if someone had told me that, then it might have been an opportunity for me to tell somebody that I was being sexually abused by him. We saw children not having access to support, so being deemed too unstable for child and adolescent mental health services, for example. And what was very interesting to us is very often the rapid reviews that we looked at and the case reviews were often, they had been chosen to be undertaken because of very high levels of mental distress, sometimes requiring deprivation of liberty, or kind of other risks like sexual exploitation that were happening to children. And there was somewhere in there a very small line that said, and this child was abused within the family some years before, for example. But there had been no support around that original intrafamilial child sexual abuse, and no consideration with the reviews of the fact that actually had that been dealt with at the time, perhaps we wouldn't then be in the situation that we're in now. And just to end this theme here with some advice from a child that was spoken to, who said, ask more direct questions and keep children informed. There's the second theme here around not understanding parents and carers' context, vulnerabilities and needs. So what we saw in particular was a real lack of understanding in relation to domestic abuse and coercive control and the impact that that has on parents' ability to protect. So we saw an unrealistic over-reliance on parents and carers who often had many vulnerabilities to protect their children without giving the guidance and support that they needed to be able to do that, or communicating with them in a way that they could understand. So, for example, with parents with English as a second language or parents with learning needs. We relied heavily on parents who were living in domestic abuse situations to supervise contact, for example, and we had some examples of written agreements that were being used. For example, a 7-month pregnant mum who was asked to sleep in front of the children's bedroom door to stop the other sibling coming in and abusing that child. We saw a kind of theme of not believing parents, and that was particularly within the court setting. So parents who were part of acrimonious proceedings, for example, when a mother was alleging that there had been sexual abuse or her child had told her of sexual abuse, she wasn't believed. It was felt that it was kind of malicious, and children were placed then with people at risk. There was also a real lack of support for parents. So bearing in mind, many of these parents had a lot of vulnerabilities. There wasn't the support then for their own issues around mental health or substance misuse, for example, and how they could, any advice for parents or carers about how they could then support children who had by that point been sexually abused. So advice from a parent on this theme was work with parents by listening to their views more and offer support to them. The third theme was around challenges in identifying signs, understanding risk and raising concerns. So we saw a real barrier in identifying signs. Now, remembering the systemic context for this, there has been a lack of training and resources. This is emotionally difficult work, like Annie spoke about at the start. Good supervision is really important. However, managers often haven't had training on sexual abuse either. So within that context, we saw many practitioners across all agencies who didn't know what signs and indicators of sexual abuse were, or who sought other explanations when they saw them, didn't recognise signs. This was particularly seen in disabled children, where often their signs and indicators were put down to being their diagnosed condition. Interestingly, we equally saw children and young people who had been given diagnosis, a mental health diagnosis, but actually the signs, it was about sexual abuse, not mental health, and yet they received a diagnosis for that. Also, we saw that stereotypes and assumptions around both victims and those who harm, and a real lack of understanding of the signs of grooming, so the signs and the people around the child of concern. And that linked very clearly into very poor quality assessments of risk. So as I said on the slide before, 1/3 of reviews featured someone who had a known history of sexual abuse. And yet we saw convicted people moving in with no risk assessments, less recent concerns not being seen as significant, police not really probing situations, concerns by family members or public not being taken seriously, limited analytical thinking, particularly in relation to online child sexual abuse, where that crossed over with familial, probation not being invited to strategy meetings, and confusion generally on different agencies' risk assessments. And advice from a child on this theme was be more attuned to children's mental health needs and the reasons behind these. So the final theme just to cover then, it was in relation to responding to concerns of intrafamilial child sexual abuse. Now, the kind of big thing here that struck us was around inappropriate evidential thresholds. Okay, so believing that the criminal standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt was needed to take action rather than applying the safeguarding standard of proof, which is the balance of probabilities. So where there was no verbal report, no safeguarding action was being taken. And people were saying, well, how can we record it if we don't have the evidence? So what we saw was that the system became paralysed when police chose not to take forward an investigation. So social care would say, well, what can we do? Police aren't taking it forward. And then that left other agencies not knowing what they could do. And worst case scenario, not believing children or thinking they can't then talk to children about what they had reported. There was also kind of an inadequate kind of understanding and exploration of how concerns could be recorded and shared, confusion over parental consent, poor understanding of information sharing. So, for example, police not bringing a history of information. So in many of the cases, we knew these people were of risk, and yet that information wasn't shared. Also, not agencies not being informed of the outcome of referrals, a lack of kind of collaborative working, and then drift and delay. So individual incidences of harmful sexual behaviour or indicators of concern around sexual abuse not being seen in the bigger picture. So not having a chronology that could then inform work going forward. I'm now going to pass over to Jenny.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm a member of the Child Practice Review panel, and I was on the subgroup that was involved in supporting this review. So I'm going to talk about the headlines, the learning from the fieldwork. And we have to say, and those of you who've read the report, or at least the executive summary, that it does highlight a systemic failure across all services. And I've seen some questions in the chat. We're talking about across all services, multi-agency working to recognise and respond to children, and especially in terms of the risk assessment about whether or not they were at risk of or already being sexually abused by somebody in their family environment. And we're talking about extended family, but also people, adults that came to live within their home. So the practice issues, the sort of headlines that we have identified: not hearing children's voices and understanding their needs, and Anna's already talked about that in some depth, but what I'd like to just re-emphasize is reviews, and remember that this has come from evidence from reviews from your local areas, particularly looking at understanding children's behaviour within, for example, school or within their families, and not really looking underneath that and considering why they might be behaving in that way. Not understanding parents and carers' context and their vulnerabilities and needs. So putting this into assessments and plans to support families. So if for parents who haven't harmed, particularly looking at supporting their needs around mental health, or if they've come from, if there's been violence in the family, as Anna was saying earlier. There were clear challenges in identifying signs, understanding risk, and raising concerns. And a lot of this was about the feedback from the practitioners who were involved in the fieldwork is about confidence in their skills, and also confidence in the multi-agency system to have the skills to be able to work together, particularly when there wasn't certainty or there hadn't been a verbal disclosure. So really important around that risk assessment, being multi-agency, looking at all the information and beginning to understand why the presenting risks are happening. And then issues in responding to concerns of intrafamilial child sexual abuse. So responding when there hadn't been a verbal disclosure, but there were other concerns in the family, opening people's minds to the possibility of child sexual abuse and confidence about talking about that within the multi-agency system, but also with children and with families as well. So having the skills to do that. And again, just going back to what Anna was saying about the threshold for action being that broader safeguarding and balance of probabilities and an over-reliance on criminal evidence. So key learning for practitioners. So here we've just put this into 3 areas: systemic challenges, challenges in practice, and professional development. Children are often ignored or disbelieved, and risks posed by family members are frequently overlooked or minimised. It was very clear in the reviews that were undertaken that there were opportunities to provide support and to extend risk assessment where there were opportunities to intervene. Practitioners were lacking the support, guidance and direction to intervene effectively. So often cases were closed because they felt there was not enough evidence to proceed. And what this led to in terms of evidence and the feedback from children and families was vulnerability to more abuse. So a sort of a start again syndrome, rather than looking at the whole history of intervention and concerns about the family. Challenges in practice: practitioners relying too heavily on children to verbally report abuse and not looking at other signs of abuse that might be happening, particularly in behaviour, not only of children, but also within the family, and looking at the risk factors that might make children vulnerable to sexual abuse. And what I'd really like to also say here, I don't know whether it's appropriate to say here or later on, is there is an increasing body of evidence of the connection with online abuse and abuse within the family context. So we often see that as something which is very much associated with extrafamilial child sexual abuse, but in fact, the growing body of evidence is that it's quite often linked to abuse in the home. Fear of intervening in investigations stops practitioners from talking directly to children about possible abuse. And that balance of probabilities gives people the basis to do that. But it was very clear that often professionals stopped working in this area when there was felt to be not enough evidence to proceed with a criminal investigation. So a criminal justice lens on things rather than a safeguarding lens. And then professional development, absolutely, from practitioners to strategic leaders to social work and health and police training institutions, a real recognition about the critical need for enhanced training and resources for professionals. And that goes from a qualification stage right through in terms of professional development. Practitioners needing to be equipped to recognise and respond to signs of child sexual abuse confidently. And what this means is that support can be given at an early stage rather than always feeling that this has to go to a specialist resource. And that doesn't mean to say specialist help isn't needed. But it's very clear from evidence, particularly what the centre have been doing, that early help in this area can really mitigate potential abuse further down the line. Right, so key learning for practitioners, and then I'm going to go on to key learning for the broader multi-agency system. So there's three areas here that we saw cross-cutting and would assist in terms of a holistic approach to supporting children that potentially are being sexually abused and their parents and carers who are not harming them. So we've already talked about neglect, which is really significant in our findings. Impact of domestic abuse. In a high percentage of cases that were looked at, domestic abuse and coercive control had a significant impact on parental ability to protect their children. So the presence of violence and coercive control in the home was a really key factor in terms of being able to protect children. And services involved with families often fail to recognise and address that influence of domestic abuse on safeguarding and that connection with possible child sexual abuse. Race and ethnicity, again, we really focused on this in terms of the evidence from reviews, and what the evidence showed us was that practitioners weren't always sufficiently considering children's race, ethnicity and culture in their responses, but also we could see that from the evidence from reviews in the evidence of decision making about next steps, Section 47 investigations and the services that were provided. And there was also the evidence showed a lack of understanding of specific needs and contexts of children from Black and other minoritised communities and any particular vulnerabilities that they might be exposed to in their communities, but also the services that were offered in terms of them being helpful and recognising potential issues of racism in that they might be experiencing, which needed to be taken into account in the support that they were offered. And then thirdly, disabled children are at increased risk of sexual abuse. And we know this from research, and this piece of research and the evidence from reviews very much showed that was the case. And the important finding around misinterpreting signs of abuse as related to the child's disability rather than opening our minds to the need for better understanding of disabled children's needs and what their behaviour might mean in terms of vulnerability to child sexual abuse. So key learning for safeguarding partners, and I really hope that all your safeguarding partnerships have had initial discussions on this review and have committed to the recommendations, the 6 or 7 recommendations that give them hopefully a plan to address improving practice in this area. So first of all, strategic planning, developing local action plans to respond to the report's recommendations, ensuring a coordinated approach to safeguarding. So very much, making this hopefully a priority in the business plan for the next year. And in terms of professional development, conducting a multi-agency training needs analysis and assessment as soon as possible to ensure practitioners have the necessary skills and knowledge to identify and respond to child sexual abuse. So a straightforward review of what safeguarding partnerships are already offering, and then putting a plan in place to increase the training and skills and knowledge of frontline practitioners. And then, importantly, auditing local multi-agency decision making to ensure safeguarding decisions consider all the indicators of sexual abuse, not just verbal disclosures. So really important, and to do that on a multi-agency basis, not just a single agency basis. Risk assessment and management. To review and manage individuals posing sexual harm risks, ensuring robust information sharing and collaboration. And that really very much involves making sure that probation colleagues are part of this work and part of the local safeguarding partnership. So particularly looking at that area, and we call on police colleagues, probation colleagues, local authority to particularly focus on that area. Communication with children, ensuring that practitioners are confident in talking directly to children. So checking out through your practice forums, are they confident? And that should inform, for example, the review of the training programme that's on and what's commissioned around training for this area. And then health pathways. Really, really important. A lot of discussion in the review about this, ensuring local pathways for referring children for appropriate forensic, medical and other health assessments are in place. Such a key area where children open up. Their health is often perhaps not prioritised in terms of assessment of vulnerable children, but it's really important in this area, and involving the right health professionals, particularly in strategy discussions, was a key finding to get the right advice in this area. And I'm going to hand on to Alison now, who's going to talk about, oh no, I'm not. Sorry, we're going to have questions, bit of a break here. There's lots of comments in the sidebar. I'll hand over to you, Steve.
Okay, thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Anna. So there are a number of comments, and I think some of the national panel team have already picked up on some of the questions. But just to kind of review what's coming in, there's a number of questions around the learning outcomes. So. And a few comments. So number 44, that is really interesting that we took the retraction more seriously than the disclosure. There's a question about why a child was placed with a known sex offender. I don't know whether that's a specific case or something that we can pick up on. And then there is a dialogue going on about the court's practice. Is there any engagement with the courts on issues with their practices in these areas, not just for this review, but with any SCPRs? Annie, do you want to come in there and answer one or two of those?
I was just going to pick up on the courts point because I've had some further conversations about that, and maybe Jenny and Anna can pick up and Alison pick on the other. Just on the court stuff, and I was really interested in the discussion in there from colleagues. So I think there are two sets of issues here. One is about the quality of information that comes into court, that is presented to court, including from CAFCAS as well as from others, local authority social workers, but others too, and how that does or doesn't include good risk assessments about people who may pose a risk to children. And then there's a separate issue about the awareness of the judiciary and magistrates of these issues. So There is a particular recommendation, we'll come on to in a bit, to CAFCAS to do some work in this area, which Jackie Tiotto, their chief executive, is very keen to do. And there is also a recommendation to the president of the family division. And we've had some very positive discussions with him about that. So that's around more about the awareness in the judiciary of these issues and the evidence provided in that report. So I think it's a what the space one in terms of what will happen as a result.
Great, thank you, Annie. So there is a good dialogue going on now in the chat around, in the forum chat around the courts. There is some learning from Children's House in London, number 55. Can you recommend some training that we may be able to purchase for the practitioners, or any packages that can be delivered that cover everything that you have identified practitioners need? Is there a training course out there? Thank you, Anna.
I mean, it feels a bit strange me saying this because obviously we were the lead commissioners for the report. There are a number of organisations that deliver training. We do offer a load of training in relation to intrafamilial child sexual abuse at various different levels. So if people are interested, they could look there. But there are also other organisations that I think do some of that. But we have a package for multi-agency practitioners and social workers. While I'm on, do you want me to just say something about the convicted
yes,
sex offender that you mentioned, Steve?
Yes.
So in one of the cases, what had happened is the person's sexual offence had kind of got lost in the process. So mum had a number of issues. There were concerns around neglect. He was the step parent, and everyone got focused on the kind of issues that came later rather than looking back at what happened. He'd had a conviction from when he was a bit younger, and the judge, it had been a decision in court to place with him, but I think it had got lost over time, that conviction. In other cases, it was around information not being shared. So police and probation holding information that wasn't translated over to children's social care, and children were with them. But the court decisions, and Annie touched on this already, so the CAFCAS.
So does the review lobby for more funding and equitable funding? Can we move on to the, in terms of recommendations for mandatory reporting, if implemented and legislated, will this alleviate some of the issues relating to providing information, acting on concerns regarding CSA, where the criminal evidential threshold is not met? I am unsure. So that's a question about if it doesn't make to the CPS. Quick response about that.
Sorry, I focused on the first part of your question there around mandatory reporting. So we didn't find any evidence in the cases we looked at that a mandatory reporting mechanism would have helped in any of those cases. The issue that we have really, so there is something about identification, but we didn't see people covering up what they'd seen. The issue is more about with the response. So we can refer as many cases as we like to children's social care. It's about what happens afterwards that is the problem, essentially. The second part of the question, I'm sorry, I missed. Was that in relation to criminal threshold?
Yeah, I think so. And evidence. So I've just lost it myself at the moment because people are furiously typing in. But let's move on because we've got to get to the second part of the presentation, which is the recommendations. But just be assured that these comments will be picked up by the panel, and we will go through them in detail and respond, and then publish those responses. So thanks to everybody who's making comments, and also you can respond to any of the comments that have already been made by highlighting it, and then you get a button up saying respond. So you can add your own experience, you can add some perspective, and so on. There were one or two other questions around just clarification on the crossover between online and interfamilial abuse. Do you want to make a quick comment on that, either Anna or Jenny?
Do you want me to take that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, am I still unmuted? Yeah. So it's been really interesting in terms of online child sexual abuse, because I think we've done what we did with sexual abuse generally, which is imagine this is something that happens by strangers. So strangers contacting children online. What the research is now saying actually is the majority of child sexual abuse online is by people known to the child, and the largest proportion of that people within their family environment. When you look at the images that are available online, around about half are filmed in family settings. Okay, and then the most highly traded images around child sexual abuse are around prepubescent children being sexually abused by father figures. So where do those children come from? The the only people who have access to young children generally are families. And so we really need to consider this kind of crossover. Then they're not different children often, and we need to be remembering that when we're working with them. That's also not to say that every person who looks at indecent images will present a risk to their own child, but it absolutely must be assessed, and that isn't what we saw happening in the cases that we looked at.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Anna. So we're going to move on now to, I'm going to reintroduce Alison Steele, who's going to talk about the recommendations. And Alison, I think you have control of the slides.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Alison. I was a co-panel lead for this review. And I'm just wanting to talk a little bit or review the recommendations that have come from the learning from this review. There are actually 10 national recommendations. I'm going to talk to the headlines. There is more detail in the actual report under these headlines. So recommendation 1 was to form a national strategic plan, and that government should develop and publish this plan to make sure that we can secure the necessary practice improvements identified in this report. The second recommendation was about professional knowledge, skills and confidence. We're asking government to take the necessary steps, working with our professional bodies, to ensure that practitioners and managers have the necessary skills, knowledge and capabilities, including access to relevant guidance and multi-agency training. And multi-agency training we've already discussed being a really key issue here. Recommendation 3 was around inquiries and investigations. So we are asking government to take the necessary steps to improve the quality of joint inquiries, so that decisions are more consistently in children's interests, and that's particularly around the threshold for intervention not being the criminal justice one. Moving on to recommendation 4, which is around assessment of people presenting risk of harm, because this was another key area of learning for us. We're asking government to ensure that there is a robust assessment and management of people who present a risk of sexual harm and who have contact with children. Recommendation 5, a really important one. They all are important, but this is one that's particularly close to my heart, that government is to ensure that practitioners understand that they can talk and should talk directly to children and families about concerns of sexual abuse. Recommendation 6 is for health. So government should ask NHS England and the public health commissioners to audit local commissioning arrangements to ensure that pathways and services are in place to identify and respond to the health needs of sexually abused children. And this is for both recent and non-recent abuse. We found from the reviews and from listening to practitioners that often there was difficulties with children having assessments for non-recent abuse. Recommendation 7 is about criminal investigations and charging advice. Government should take action so that there's clear and agreed process for ensuring that where cases cannot be considered against the threshold test, early charging advice is sought in cases of intrafamilial child sexual abuse. So that really is about getting on with making decisions about where the criminal investigation is going. Recommendation 8, we've talked a little bit about concerns about family court. So recommendation 8 was directly to the panel, to the president of the family division, asking him to consider the findings of this review and determine what actions are needed to support judicial decision making when children may have been sexually abused. So I think Annie's already discussed this. We're also asking CAFCAS to consider the findings of this review, determine what actions it may need to take. I think there are 2 issues here, aren't there? There's what is presented to the court and then the decisions that the court makes on that information that's presented to them. And then lastly, recommendation 10 for the inspectorates. We're asking the inspectorates to consider the findings of this review. So in addition to these 10 national recommendations, there are 6 recommendations for local safeguarding partnerships, which essentially align with these recommendations, giving some more sort of operational guidance about how we can take these things forward. But I think the main message to local safeguarding partnerships is basically, please do just get on with this. Don't wait for national government responses. Consider these recommendations, what you can do locally, and start to action plan to implement them. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. You very adequately predicted the questions that are coming up about who is leading on the recommendations. You've mentioned, in fact, we said earlier about the partnerships hoping to have picked up on these learnings, at least tabled them in their discussions and their meetings. The government will formally be responding. I think that's a will. The government will be formally responding to the national recommendations. That's a statement, not a question, maybe from one of the panel members. Thank you, Jenny. There's a comment about recommendation 5. KCSIE is really clear about this. Staff can ask children directly whether they have been harmed and the nature of that harm. But I find schools have not updated their policies, procedures to reflect this. Still too much do not ask leading questions. A little bit more on that, Alison, about
yes, I was
disclosure.
just going to say that we've actually discussed with the CPS around this issue, and they're really clear that as long as you document what you've said and what the responses are, they've got absolutely no issue with children being and families actually being directly talked to. So it's about actually naming what the concerns are in an explicit way. It's almost about understanding what words you can use and what approach you can take. And that's very much down, I think, to training as well, so that you can have a practice and a thought about how you can approach children and how you speak to them.
Yeah, and I think we had a comment earlier about whether children were attempting to tell somebody and how you knew, and you talked about the nuance within the schools and things to spot changes of behaviour and not just expect a verbal response from a child from a direct question. Jenny, you got your hand up?
Yeah, it was just on in terms of evidence, and when we talked to police colleagues as part of this review, it was clear in their guidance what it said is evidence to proceed at this stage, which is different from closing down a case. So, and I think that's a very helpful comment, really, in terms of addressing the whole issue around threshold for intervention, which was picked up quite clearly in the report and from the evidence in reviews. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Anna.
Just linking to that point, I wonder whether it's worth saying that one of the things we're strongly asking for and asking on partnerships to make sure it doesn't happen is this comment, no further action, and asking people to use the comment, no further police action at this time, because there needs to be a safeguarding response whether or not the police are taking further action. And we know that language is powerful. So we're asking for that change.
Thank you, Anna. Annie?
Just going back to the point about government response. Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the roles of the panel is, it's not just to produce, big reports like this. And we know it is a big report and there's a lot in it and there's a lot of recommendations in it, which will be, quite challenging to implement, but they must be implemented. So part of our role is to kind of, hold government to account for the implementation of those recommendations. I mean, there's obviously a lot of live conversation about child sexual abuse at the moment, albeit not particularly specifically focused on the family. And we will do everything that we can, and we hope other key stakeholders, particularly national bodies, will kind of join us in really sort of emphasising to government the absolute imperative of taking these recommendations forward. I think it's fair to say that, we have met obviously with senior officials all along the way and with some of the key government ministers. We have, we've been, I think we feel positive about their determination and commitment, but obviously we need to see the kind of letter and the kind of, the I's being dotted on the responses and so on.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Annie. There's a whole flood of comments coming in now, and we'll pick up on some of those. But I also want to give everybody the opportunity of just raising their hand here in MS Teams and asking an old-fashioned verbal question. So please know that that's available to you. There's a little icon saying raise. It'll raise your hand and alert us to the fact you want to ask a question. There are a number of comments about SCPs need more funding to be able to deliver multi-agency training. There was a comment about training that is delivered face-to-face, and a rather disappointing expectation that people who have received the training online haven't appeared to learn anything. That's a reflection. I would totally agree about the funding for delivery of multi-agency training as above. This is number 61. We have just paid over £3,000 for 2 sessions, which is delivered by those with lived experience of abuse, including sexual abuse. So impactful and well attended. Coincidentally, their key takeaway is, if only someone had asked me. So please, if you're willing, share more information about that course, and including people with lived experience. The other questions have been about the assumption that partnerships have already discussed these. I know the report was published in November, so there may not have yet been time, but we would absolutely recommend that you include this in your partnership board agendas. So a question: when you say children attempted to tell somebody about the abuse, what does this mean? Is it that they made direct disclosures that were ignored, or referrals to external services that were not made? Is there data about which services these relate to? So again, going back to that issue about, you know, how the child might disclose what's been happening.
Would you like?
Yeah, Anna, that'd be great. Quick comment on that. Thank you.
So it was a mixture of two. So we had some children very clearly saying things, but then, as I spoke about before, that retraction. So, you know, we had a situation which is talked about in the report, where a child had told a worker that there had previously been an investigation, so she really didn't want to go and live with her stepfather. That was kind of, at the time, had been no further actioned. They then kind of spoke to the father, who said no, it never happened. They spoke to the mum, who said no, she often makes things up. And then that child was then kind of responded to as a child who made up stories, was then placed with the stepfather, who went on to sexually abuse her. We had other young people who gave like multiple signs of sexual abuse, including pregnancy, and agencies didn't ask. In terms of the data of all of those things, I suspect that's confidential data, but we have got quite a number of examples in the report of the different ways in which children were kind of either said something or were showing us in every which way, but hadn't actually verbally said something. Yeah. So that's just a couple of examples.
Good. Thank you. And there's a couple of comments referring to Baroness Jay's recent report, and the comments about the lack of implementation of recommendations. And we heard very clearly from Annie, I think, saying that these are recommendations, and sponsored by the national panel and the DFE. So it's kind of placed with the partnerships to pick up on the recommendations and include them. There is a comment about we are seeing, number 69, we are seeing challenges where the police are putting bail conditions of perpetrator remaining in the home when under investigation for online sexual offending. Police not recognising increased risk to children living with the family at home. I think, Alison, you mentioned that it wasn't automatic that somebody viewing images was going to engage in sexual abuse of children, but that's necessarily a bit of a concern. Is there a quick comment on that?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can you just read that out to me again? It keeps moving around, and then
so we are seeing challenges where the police are putting bail conditions on perpetrators remaining in the home when under investigation of online sexual offending. So the police are not recognising increased risk to children who are living in the family home.
I mean, it's really worrying if police are actually putting bail conditions in, but they absolutely need to be challenged if there hasn't been a risk assessment. So the point is undertaking a risk assessment, because in some situations that might be all right, but the risk assessment absolutely has to happen before that decision is made, rather than just assumed, essentially. And police need to be challenged on that, because police also have a safeguarding role. It's not just about that kind of criminal justice role.
Absolutely managing that risk. Thank you. So we're sort of out of time. The incredible number of comments and thankfully, useful thoughts and suggestions that are coming in will be responded to. I'll work with the national panel to make sure that we have a response to all those comments. And you're welcome to check back in just by clicking the link again and seeing the other questions that you perhaps haven't had a chance to look at and read properly. This session will be open through the link for the next few days, so let's say a week.
Steve,
I will then.
Steve,
yes.
There's one colleague who's got their hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. I'm really sorry I missed that. Over to you. Meeting guest, you're billed as.
Oh,
tell us who you are.
I'm Sue Walters.
Yeah. Hi, Sue.
Yeah. I'm just curious, really, as someone, obviously, I work with partnerships. I work as a designated nurse most of the time. I do consultancy. And I suppose I just see a challenge. I really like the recommendations. I like everything, but as most of my colleagues here, we work at the front line, so to speak. And I think one of the challenges is at a system level, at the boards, at partnerships, children's partnerships, where, if we're honest, the three at the top doesn't always work very well. And I think it's great to say you're sharing it with the partnerships, but I wonder if there's something that you might want to do. I don't know what, but really to think about that, because I think that's for me, that's part of the issue, in that because they're not working together. So you've got the ICB, police, local authority. It doesn't feel, it's not cohesive. It's not challenging. They're not really, sometimes they don't have the right people there. And I think that, and I know this has been raised over a number of years, but I think until you've got that really right, you can't really get the change that you want underneath, if that makes sense. That's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you.
Shall I take that?
Yeah,
I'll take that very quickly. I'm involved with a number of safeguarding partnerships. One of them partnerships, I can see people on the call, and we've been talking about this as a panel because we have links with partnerships, things like expecting, we're going to think about how we can monitor progress on those recommendations in partnerships, expecting at the very least it's in annual reports. And we thought about the recommendations and tested them out. They're very doable. I saw the stuff around resources, but they are doable, and there is an absolute real expectation that they're going to, partnerships have got to get their heads around this. So really welcome your comments, because we do feel the panel has a role in that, in saying, of course these are optional, they're recommendations, but they're not really, as you say, they make a lot of sense. And this is from evidence from safeguarding partners. This is from evidence from LSCPRs. It is their evidence that this has all been based on, plus obviously research as well. So this is what they're telling us. Yes. So, they need to be thinking about recommendations. And I would really urge you all on this call to be asking your partnerships, when have they looked at this? When are they going to look at it? And how are they going to do recommendations? Because, it should be the coordination there that will make this multi-agency and give practitioners confidence on the ground. So there you go.
Perfect.
But we certainly have heard what you said. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you for your question, Sue. So an enormous amount of good stuff gone into the forum. We will process that. We will get that back to you. We will be producing a video of this webinar. We're about out of time, but I absolutely want to give Annie Hudson just the opportunity to close us out. And thank you for everyone who joined. And Annie, over to you.
Thanks. And, just to really endorse fully what Jenny's just said about, going back and with your colleagues in your teams, having those conversations about, is this true for us? How do we need to change our practice, whether you're a leader, a frontline practitioner, whatever. It is a big report. I think it's, as one very senior official said to me, government official said, it's a very shocking and very powerful report. But it is a big read. We think it's really important that people involved in safeguarding children really do read this and think about what it means for their practice. You will get the slides. You will, just to manage expectations a bit, get a summary of the responses to the questions, depending on how many there are. And we will, as a panel, be kind of keeping you updated through our newsletter about where the recommendations, particularly the national ones, are going. This was the first, and there were so many so much interest in this that we're having a second webinar, which has been, I think, also publicised. So if you have colleagues who you think would appreciate and benefit from coming to the second webinar, please pass on the information to them. Thank you finally for all your very thoughtful reflections, comments, questions. I'm sorry that we've only had an hour in which to kind of capture some of the discussion on these really important themes, but hopefully that's kind of, if you like, whetted your thirst for kind of thinking more and working differently in what this really important space, we know as a panel that we've got much more work to do in this area. So thank you, and thank you to colleagues from around the country.
Great. Thank you, Annie. And again, we're out of time, but
Thank
there is an
you.
evaluation. Just wanted to say that, as Annie said, this is the beginning of a series of webinars, and we're always looking to improve the level of engagement and interaction and get your response. So please fill out that evaluation survey. The link is in the MS Teams chat here and also in the forum. And you can check back in the forum just by copying that link and going in at any point as we process those questions and pick up some responses in the next few days. Thanks very much, everybody else, and have a good afternoon. Thanks. Bye-bye.